Hello, and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm Robert Arnason of the Western Producer, your host for this week's show. Lobbying government is a normal part of doing business in Canada, including in the world of food and farming. Ryan Cardwell, a University of Manitoba agricultural economist, says Canada's ag sector has been very successful in the business of rent-seeking. That is, getting the rules changed in its favor. Also on today's show, Kevin Yaworski of Glacier FarmMedia speaks to a Seedmaster rep about the company's new products for 2022. But first up on the show, Canadian farmers are facing increasing pressure to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. As an example, in early March, Agriculture Canada released yet another document explaining its plan to reduce emissions from fertilizer by 30% in the next 8 years. To make that happen, the government needs farmers to support the plan, but many producers, including Christian Hebert of Moosomin, Saskatchewan, feel that farmers are being unfairly labeled as climate change villains. But before we get to Christian, here's a word from our sponsor.
We knew we were doing something right when our competition started swearing every time they talked about us. Just the other day, I heard someone saying, "Have you seen this f***ing Seedmaster Ultra Pro 2? They got third-party PAMI testing that confirms its individual row metering delivers uniform f***ing seed placement, near zero seed mortality, and no impact on f***ing germination results." We take it as a huge f***ing compliment. Start raising your f***ing ROI at seedmaster.ca.
All right, as promised, here is Christian Hebert, who operates Hebert Grain Ventures in Moosomin, Saskatchewan. Hey Christian, thanks for coming on Between the Rows. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
So some of our listeners may know who you are, but for those folks who don't, can you tell us a bit about your farm?
Yeah, for sure. We own and operate Hebert Grain Ventures in southeast Saskatchewan. We're at Moosomin, so kind of 10 miles from the Manitoba border and 60 miles from the U.S. border. We grow canola, malt barley, fall rye, yellow peas, hard red spring wheat, and some oats occasionally. We'll crop pretty close to 30,000 acres this year, but definitely haven't always been that way. We've expanded quite a bit in the last 12 or 15 years. And that's really through a focus on implementing a great team. We got a great crew of people that can execute on a daily basis, probably better than I can, to be honest, and that's led to our growth.
Okay, thanks for that description. So I'm just going to start with my personal observation here. So in the last year, I'm thinking I've seen probably about 30 press releases from the federal government talking about their plans and goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. What do you think about all this focus on farming and this urgency to cut emissions from farms in Canada? What's your thoughts on that?
So, I'll start at a high level first. First of all, I think all farms have been focused on sustainability for history. It's one of the best industries in the world for passing on businesses and farms through the generations. And the only way we can do that is by improving our land generation after generation, right? So we want to improve the land and we want to improve the financial stability of the farm. That allows us to pass it on, which is, in my mind, that is the definition of sustainability. The marketing world and the federal government have just decided to start using that word. So that's really high level. Kind of my next comment would be, I find it a little bit ironic that the governments in the world won't hold other countries accountable, i.e., we won't talk to China or Russia about what should be done for greenhouse gases. But I've seen a lot of articles on cow farts, which is a little bit ironic when we want to talk about a global trade and global, economy, but yet we won't deal with some of the big elephants in the room.
Okay.
And then my last point would just be, I hope the federal government takes the time to really look at the science and have the discussions with agriculture about this as it gets implemented. Because my true belief is agriculture is the solution, not the culprit. So for instance, they talk about emissions from our fertilizer, from our tractors, and yet they want to put a baseline in around zero-till. Well, zero-till's improvement to organic matter and carbon sink has been phenomenal over the last 30 or 40 years, but because we've done it, they don't want to add it into the calculation. When in fact, I would argue that most farmers are already net positive, not just net neutral. We just have to do the science correctly and get the calculations right behind all of this new information and new data we have.
Okay. Let's just talk for a second about fertilizer, because that also is receiving a great deal of attention. And so the federal government, has basically come out and said that they want to cut greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizer by 30% by 2030, which is not that far away. And they want to do all this without compromising crop yields. What's your reaction to that?
My first reaction is that it's more of a wording issue than it is a policy issue. So if you look at what we've done in production in agriculture in the last decade or 20 or 30 years specifically, we grow more grain per unit of fertilizer than we have in our entire life, and we continue to improve on how we do that. So a mass reduction of 30%, I think, is completely illogical. However, discussions on can we continue to have higher output on less units of input, I think is a fair discussion. I think things like nitrogen inhibitors and biologicals and new types of fertilizer and how we use it are all great discussions to have and things that farmers and government need to work on together. It's just this, the way they're wording it right now is they just want a mass reduction of 30% versus talking about can we continue to have higher output per unit of input, that I think is a more logical way to look at it and something that's actually attainable.
So let's just hone in on that for a second. So the language here is obviously important, but when somebody says they want an absolute cut of emissions, that really sort of dictates the policy or the practice, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that absolute cut is what leads to what I would say is improper policy. And what I mean by improper policy is that if it doesn't create alignment on the decisions by those that are actually doing the work in the dirt versus the government, you don't achieve what you want to achieve. So if we drop greenhouse gas emissions by half a point by dropping fertilizer, use by a flat 30% across Canada, but it drops our agriculture output by 30%, because that's about what's going to happen. That doesn't work if GDP and agriculture output drop to pick up a half a point of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's how do we work together so that our output remains at least where it is, if not continues to improve as we get new technologies. But at the same time, of course, we want to do the right thing. But it's just that we work together to ensure that the science has been done and that we're using the right data and getting credit for all the things that we're doing right already.
So let's get back to what you said earlier about, the government's decision to kind of have a cutoff date when it comes to, no-till, basically saying that things that happened before this year or this time, we're not going to count that. My interpretation of that is that it kind of sends the wrong message to producers. It sort of sends a message, well, thank you for doing that for the last 25 years, but, at the same time, we're not really giving you credit for that. Do you think that has got a lot of producers sort of upset or got their backs up a bit around this issue?
Yeah, for sure I would. I mean, a lot of us have implemented zero-till because we think it's the right thing to do for our farm for the exact reasons that the government wants everybody to implement it. But it goes back to kind of this theory that, carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, everything that went on at COP26, these are global theories or global policy that we're working on, the Paris Accords, right? Mm-hmm. Now, we need to have global policy and global ideas, but we need to have regional strategies in order to accomplish that. And so if they want to have the majority of the world get to zero-till because they think it's better for everybody, that's fantastic. But the regions that are already doing it should not be penalized for being ahead of the curve because you're still accomplishing the right thing. They just did it earlier. So that would be where I struggle with it, in that why is it almost a penalty that you've been ahead of the curve on sustainability? Because as a farmer, we've cared about sustainability forever. All of a sudden, the government wants to use the word, yet really we've used that word for centuries in agriculture.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that. In an email, not yourself, but one of your communication folks or employees kind of noted that you guys would like to see a bit more focus around testing sensors on the landscape to kind of get a real understanding of what amount of carbon is going into the soil, what amount is being emitted. What are you talking about exactly? What kind of testing and sensors are you referring to?
Well, the first step would be you take a company like Acre Value in the U.S., the amount of data, soil survey data and knowledge on land that's widely available in the U.S. is significantly better than Canada. And then you go to the next step of, say, South America, where virtually nothing of it, none of that is available. So to get to the point where you could have better data on the land to start with. Secondly, we're doing a bunch of work with a couple of universities in the U.S. on carbon testing, which is, you basically need 36-inch to 48-inch soil tests to get your baseline. That includes, bulk density tests, carbon burn-off tests, which have not really been part of our normal soil testing structure in Canada up till now. And it's pretty expensive, up to $40-45 an acre to figure that out.
Okay.
Now, do we need it on every acre? No, we probably don't, but we probably need it on enough acres that all of a sudden we can use algorithms and AI to mass, at least determine what Western Canada is doing. And I think the government needs to step up in that area. The next point would be, we've been doing a lot of work with soil probes and understanding what's going on in the top 4 feet of soil, especially from a water standpoint. I think we really do understand quite well what's going on with crops above the ground, but not so much below the ground. And then, so there's a bunch of work I think we need to improve on what's going on in that 4 feet of soil, right to the point of, I got good friends in the potato industry, and they've got electronic potatoes about the size of your fist, sensors that they put in the hill beside the potatoes, and it measures everything from when they harvest that potato till it ends up in the shed, all the times it gets bumped, because obviously bruising is their issue. Well, there's got to be a way that we figure out a sensory type network that we can figure out more of what's going on in the 4 feet of soil. I had no idea that most of our crops were rooted down, a full 4 feet by the end of the third week, at least the end of the 4th week of June. Canola, wheat, barley, and we're wicking water from that low until we started using these moisture probes, which then really gives you a different outlook on what yield potential is based on what you have stored for water, etc. And that's going to be the same discussion when we better understand how they're converting nutrients, how they're converting CO2. But right now, we don't actually know all that.
Right. So just to summarize what you're saying there, it sounds like we're kind of coming up with these policies or wanting to implement these practices without fully understanding what exactly is happening in the soil, how fertilizer is used, how nutrients are used, how carbon sequestered. Like, there's still a lot of unanswered questions here before you come up and say, let's do this to solve this problem.
Completely agree. One website worth checking out is a bunch of French scientists. It's called 4 per 1,000.
Okay.
And they talk about how much the organic matter is actually improved in a lot of areas in the world already. Because, CO2 goes into a plant through photosynthesis and goes down into the soil. Like, crops are some of the best carbon sinks in the world. And I agree with you. Currently, the way policy is being made, we are going to incentivize practices, not outcomes. So I can already see, I've already been in discussions of best management practices being incentivized, such as nitrogen inhibitors, such as cover crops, and different type fall cropping, stuff like that. Now, there's a big difference in a cover crop in Saskatchewan, where I have 3 feet of snow and 8 feet of frost for 6 months of the year, versus a cover crop in Brazil, where if they don't do a cover crop, their soil blows away. Erosion is a huge problem. So to incentivize practices versus actual outcomes really doesn't always lead to, what I would call decision alignment between policy and the actual people that have to implement these things.
Okay. Last one here. You're obviously now speaking out about this. Other producers, people in the ag industry, aren't really totally comfortable with the direction the government's going. Do you have hope that things could change, that the policy could evolve to something that, is different from what it looks like now?
I mean, so yes, I have hope. I mean, there's talks of future governments getting rid of the carbon tax and the carbon policy. But I guess for my travels around the U.S. and around Europe, I would say that the carbon discussion is probably here to stay for at least a while, because it is something the consumer really believes in. And in the end, the consumer writes the check for our product. So what I believe we need to do in agriculture is make sure we're part of the discussion and part of the science to actually really show and highlight that agriculture is the solution that they're looking for carbon, especially in the United States and Canada, where we have as many arable acres as we do. It should be something we're branding and really putting forward, and that our government policymakers are looking at as the solution, not the culprit. And currently, I wouldn't say that agriculture feels that way. I would say agriculture feels that we're kind of getting the finger pointed at as the culprit because we're such a small percentage of the votes and it's easy to do. I'm not saying that's what actually happened, that's what's happening, but that is definitely the feeling in agriculture. And I don't believe that collaboration between the government and agriculture producers has been something that we can brag about for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And it's something that really needs to improve, especially in a country like Canada, where agriculture is such a large portion of our GDP.
Right. Well, thanks, Christian. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and coming on Between the Rows.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for your time.
You've been listening to Christian Hebert, who farms near Moosomin, Saskatchewan. Next up on the show, seeding is just around the corner in Western Canada, at least in parts of the prairies that don't have 5 feet of snow on the ground. Kevin Jaworski of Glacier FarmMedia recently spoke to Tim Criddle, Global Sales Director at Seedmaster, about the company's latest seeding technology. Here's what Tim had to say.
Hi, I'm Kevin Jaworski with Glacier FarmMedia. So today I'm here with Tim Criddle, Global Sales Director of Seedmaster Manufacturing. Hi, Tim, and welcome to Between the Rows.
Thank you, Kevin. Happy to be here.
So, Tim, what are the 3 main advantages that the Ultra SR offers growers over the other traditional seeding solutions?
Well, there are basically 3 conversations that we have with the growers that are using the Ultra SR today and those that are interested in acquiring one in the future. And those 3 main topics of conversation typically revolve around, first of all, being the cost of acquisition, being that the Ultra SR is the first seeding solution of its kind with an all-in-one design where the 750 bushel cart is basically integrated with a toolbar all in one. So a 60-foot toolbar, 750 bushel cart. That gives us the ability to go to market with about a 15 to 20% cost advantage over a more traditional design with a toolbar and a cart separately. The other thing that factors into the cost that a lot of people have reported back to us is that with the really efficient horsepower requirements in that 375 to 400 horsepower and only requiring about 36 gallon per minute hydraulics, that this allows them to continue to use a tractor that they already have on the farm. And they don't then have that second part of the conversation with the dealer to say, look, I need to upgrade my tractor as well. So the path to upgrade is quite cost efficient. Second of all is the ease of use. Farmers that are using these, they report back, they can't believe how easy it is to transport in terms of field use, how easy it is to maneuver it in the field, to pull it up to the side of the field. For filling, they can fill it up way more effortlessly than ever before with another configuration. They can back this thing up because it's not a train. The depth change, literally, you can go along the back of the Ultra SR and change your depth in about 5 minutes. I mean, that is unheard of in the seeding tool business. And then there's the agronomic factor. Fast, uniform emergence, which is a hallmark of Seedmaster technology to begin with. You get single pass benefits of your seed and fertilizer being placed at the same time, but you get planter-like precision. and which makes it just simply ideal for not just canola, although it really shines in canola, but your seed and your fertilizer are placed so precisely in adjacent rows where the seed, as it emerges, has immediate access to the fertilizer, and you get that fast, uniform emergence, which gives that crop the ability to pop out of the ground and have the best opportunity to maximize its potential through the growing season.
Excellent. No, sounds like some really good advantages there. So, Tim, what exactly is the Ultra Pro 2 distribution system, and why is it beneficial?
So we've had the Ultra Pro 2 distribution system available as an on-frame or onboard option that we could put on our toolbar for a number of years. And we've taken that concept and expanded it. And basically that is the entire distribution system on the Ultra SR system today. And what that is having a dedicated single seed and fertilizer meter per individual opener at the ground. There is no more distributing seed through high velocity fans, through big distribution towers, and the lack of even distribution that is a potential with that type of system. And of course, the damaging nature of running a vulnerable seed like canola through a distribution tower where you can damage it. It becomes, basically, say if you're seeding it at a rate of 5 pounds per acre, and knowing that you factored in about 2 pounds per acre that's going to die in the process, and you're putting dead seeds in the ground, the UP2 eliminates that, and you get planter-like singulation and near zero mortality, especially in your canola. And today, with canola seed at about $14 a pound, if you're saving approximately 2 pounds an acre, you're looking at $28 an acre just in savings, just on the gentle seed handling.
Yeah, definitely important on a year like this. So, Tim, my understanding is the single rank design is new. So why did Seedmaster develop an air drill with a single rank, and how can users expect to benefit from that?
Well, the single rank eliminates a lot of weight. So it creates an efficient machine, cost-effective, already talked about that. But maybe more importantly is the fact that with that single rank, it allows the openers to follow the ground uniformly. There are no more chances of, say, in a 3 or 4 rank toolbar, where the lead openers will dig into the ground and lift the back openers out of the ground, where you get uneven seed and fertilizer placement. With a single rank, it literally hugs and contours and follows the ground evenly. That means that we're precisely planting it at the same exact depth, every seed and all of the fertilizer. And that's the type of thing that really helps to give us that fast, uniform emergence. The growth is uniform throughout the growing season, which means that you're able to spray the crop all at the same time because it's at the same growth stage. And of course, your burn down or your pre-harvest work is all at the same time because it's all matured at exactly the same time throughout the field.
So, Tim, if growers are looking to find out more information, how do they go about doing that?
Well, we're excited to have a couple of shows upcoming this summer. The crop show in Regina and Ag Emotion in just outside of Saskatoon, where we're going to have these machines on display. Our dealers, a number of our dealers, are going to have machines that they've ordered up for spring demonstration purposes, so people can see them live in their fields potentially. And of course, any one of our dealers is a great resource. They're all trained up. And barring that, have a look at it on our website at seedmaster.ca.
We'll be looking forward to that. So great. Thank you very much, Tim. And again, that was Tim Criddle, Global Sales Director for Seedmaster Manufacturing, on this edition of Between the Rows. Thanks for coming on today, Tim.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it.
That was Tim Criddle, Global Sales Director at Seedmaster. Finally, every year, the University of Manitoba Department of Agriculture hosts the Darrell Kraft Lecture to honor the former professor of ag economics. This year's lecturer was Ryan Cardwell, U of M agricultural economist, who spoke about rent-seeking in Canadian agriculture. Alan Dawson of the Manitoba Co-operator spoke to Ryan following the lecture.
I was wondering if you could talk about what are rent seekers and how might they affect lobbying efforts and how that might affect agricultural policy.
Sure. Well, I mean, anyone can be a rent seeker, and most of us are in some form. But in the context of what I was discussing a few weeks ago in the lecture and in my research and teaching, typically rent seekers are the individuals or groups, so it could be a producer group or a lobby group, who tries to influence policymakers in a way that the policymakers change the rules of the game in their favor. So, in the context of my work, that often takes the form of a lobby group trying to convince the government to do things like provide more subsidies or higher levels of subsidies, or to reduce competition through restricting trade, restricting imports, or allowing cartels to form in production, or exemptions from regulations, so carbon tax exemptions, things like that. So any attempt to convince those who are in control of the policy levers, like regulators or policymakers, to change the rules in their favor. And so when those efforts are successful and policies are steered by those efforts, you create winners and losers, right? So higher returns from lower competition to producers are paid through higher costs borne by consumers, for example. And those types of efforts have historically been quite successful in agriculture. We observe quite high rates of protection and subsidy in agricultural industries, in an industry with fairly high family incomes already. And if you compare subsidy rates on average across agricultural industries to non-agricultural industries, they're typically quite high. So that's sort of the most simplified version is just classic lobbying, right? Lobbying MPs or senators or whoever to form policy in your favor.
I think a lot of farm groups feel that a certain amount of subsidy or risk mitigation through safety net programs is justified because of the market and weather risks that farmers face. But wondering, and I think when we talked earlier, you'd mentioned that farm income stabilization may be sometimes needed, but you made the point that some of that support could be, or that stabilization could be brought about without subsidies. I was wondering if you could comment a bit further on that.
Sure. So, at the beginning of your question, you mentioned stabilization and you mentioned subsidization, and those are actually different things. At least they should be different things. But unfortunately, the way that we conduct policy now is they get mixed up into one policy tool. And, for example, agri-insurance does both of those things. So certainly there are these inherent characteristics in agricultural markets that make them very volatile. So in economics, we talk about inelastic supply and demand, right? So when something happens, if there's a weather shock, for example, a drought or something, prices can fluctuate wildly, much more than in many other markets, right? So the prices at which farmers are selling their output are very volatile, and so their incomes are very volatile. Their market-based incomes are very volatile. So, there may very well then be a good case for a stabilization tool there, in which probably some sort of insurance mechanism that stabilizes those peaks and troughs in incomes over time. And of course, that is an option. And the way that Canada does this now, though, through most programs, is through a policy, for example, like agri-insurance, that does that. It does stabilize and take out some of those peaks and troughs, but it also builds in a very heavy subsidy. So it not only takes out peaks and troughs of income, but it also subsidizes and increases the income. So those two things don't necessarily have to go together. And, it's sort of a policy decision to put them together into one tool, which, a lot of people would argue is sort of an inefficient way to do both. So if we want to stabilize farm income, there are mechanisms to do that. Insurance, which in itself doesn't have to be subsidized, right? The decision to subsidize it is a policy decision. The insurance firms could set like a premium rate that would cover those high risks, and farmers could decide whether or not they want to purchase it. And typically what we observe is farmers aren't willing to purchase it at what would be like an actuarial fair premium price. So a policy decision was made then by policymakers and politicians that they want farmers to be insured. And so to get them to buy insurance, the decision was made, well, government or taxpayers will pick up much of the tab through a subsidy. So agri insurance, for example, has about a 60% subsidy rate on the premium. So, $6 out of $10 of the fair premium is paid by taxpayers and only $4 by producers. So certainly there are very inherent traits in agriculture that make it unstable, and it's a great place for stabilization tools. But the decision to bundle that with subsidies is a policy decision. It's not, anything particularly unique to agriculture that requires subsidies.
I was looking through some Ag Canada data recently that showed that on average the last 5 years, Canadian farmers received, as I say, on average, $3.4 billion in direct payments from the government, which I think is equivalent to subsidies. And a lot of it comes from, goes through agri-insurance and agri-stability, as well as agri-invest and some other programs. I'm wondering if, if those transfers / subsidies were reduced or even ended, if farmers would see on the whole an equivalent decline in their income. And then second to that, wondering what impact that might have on the Canadian economy. And I think those are both pretty big questions.
Okay, yeah. So the numbers you quoted on sort of direct outlays of government on support programs like that, just one thing that's important to understand when you're looking at those numbers too is that is just one piece of the pie. So that's sort of one form of support that producers receive. They also receive a lot of support through other tools that don't show up on balance sheets. So trade barriers, right? So trade barriers increase the return to domestic producers. That cost is borne by consumers instead of by taxpayers, and it doesn't appear in the types of figures that you're describing. So we do have other ways to measure that. The OECD produces some estimates of that, but the support to producers is actually much higher than the measured dollars being spent by government. So your question about what would happen to farm incomes if those rates disappeared, well, you're right. That's a very big picture question, and it's a very complicated answer to try and come up with. But there would be a lot of different effects in a lot of different areas. There would probably be a change in the focus of what is produced in Canada. So by taking away government protections and supports that distort the incentives of producers, there would probably over time be a transition towards the production of things more in response to market signals than in response to government subsidies and trade protections. There'd probably be some exit in some areas of the industry, like small, less competitive producers who are only competitive with the subsidies might exit the industry, and existing ones might expand if some of the restrictions on expansion. So we would see change, absolutely. And what would it mean for the Canadian economy? I hear that kind of language a lot, and I'm an economist and I've studied economics for a long time, and I still don't understand what people really mean when they say good for the economy. The economy is a complex thing with lots of different interests. If you mean Canadian GDP growth on an annual basis, I would be hesitant to venture a guess on that. But I think the more important way to think about a question like that is anytime there is a change in policy like we're discussing, either an increase in a subsidy or a decrease in a subsidy or a change in a trade barrier, it creates winners and losers, right? So the winners of a lower trade barrier would likely be consumers, and the losers would be import competing producers, or a reduction in subsidy rates would create winners of taxpayers and losers of those who were previously receiving the subsidies. So, any attempt to try and paint that as a picture of how it would affect the Canadian economy, I think, is not particularly useful in trying to move forward on any change in policy.
You've been listening to Ryan Cardwell, an agricultural economist at the University of Manitoba. Well, that's it for this week's show. I'm Robert Arnason of the Western Producer. Thanks for listening, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
We knew we were doing something right when our competition started swearing every time they talked about us. Just the other day, I heard someone saying, "Have you seen this f***ing Seedmaster Ultra Pro 2? They got third-party PAMI testing that confirms its individual row metering delivers uniform f***ing seed placement, near zero seed mortality, and no impact on f***ing germination results." We take it as a huge f***ing compliment. Start raising your f***ing ROI at seedmaster.ca.